What's up, and welcome back to the MMA Mad Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Rizner. You can find me on Twitter at Nick Rizner, NickRizner, and we have a great interview this week, Francis Ellis, but we'll get to that in a second. First, I wanted to say a few words on Ben Askren, who announced his retirement today, stating that he has hip issues. I think he actually said that he needed a hip replacement. Now, a retirement announcement doesn't necessarily mean that it's a permanent retirement. I mean, shit, how many times have we seen that story play out in this sport, in all sports, in all walks of life, really? Actors do it. You know, it happens all the time. People retire, they come out of retirement. Rumble Johnson is talking about fighting again this summer, so it happens. But still, you know, hats off to Funky Ben Askren, assuming we have seen him for the last time. He really was the focal point, or not the, but one of the main focal points of the sport for the majority of his career. He was an outstanding wrestler who went undefeated in MMA through his first 20 fights, first with Bellator, and that, of course, came along with all the buzz that, you know, maybe this guy is better than everyone in the UFC. How would he stack up against the UFC's best? Could he just out-wrestle everybody and neutralize any opponent? You know, that's when this buzz sort of started up around him. Then he went to ONE FC and continued his dominance using that strong wrestling base. He was part of the first ever trade between two different promotions. The UFC got Ben Askren, ONE FC got Mighty Mouse. He was the Bellator welterweight champion. He was the ONE welterweight champion, defended both titles multiple times. Then, earlier this year, which I actually had to double check, it's hard to believe that it was that recent, to be honest, Ben Askren finally did get that crack at the UFC, and he made the most of it. Granted, that first fight, the stoppage was a little controversial, and we don't need to dig it all up again. It's been talked about in length on this show everywhere. But say what you want, he went toe-to-toe with one of the most violent strikers in the sport's history, and he came out on top. First-round submission victory over Robbie Lawler. That still matters. I don't care how you feel about the decision. You know, a lot of people say maybe it was an early stoppage, but if he held on to it for a second longer, he would have finished the choke. It doesn't matter. It's still impressive. It just is. You can't take that away from him. And then there was the Jorge Masvidal fight. The flying knee heard around the world. It was embarrassing, to be honest, but he kind of took it all in stride and handled the loss brilliantly. And finally, we got to see that dream matchup for fight fans. Probably the one I wanted to see most when he fought Damian Maia. Arguably the two best grapplers in the sport's history. It re-sparked that famous, you know, wrestling versus jiu-jitsu debate. It was awesome. Maia choked him out in the third round, climbed on top of the cage in Singapore, chanted jiu-jitsu to, you know, the crazy cheering crowd. Both guys earned Fight of the Night honors for their efforts, and that was his swan song. And I think that's good. You know, hey man, love him or hate him, Ben Askren moved the needle. He carved, you know, a truly unique path in this sport, and that's got to count for something, right? It's got to be celebrated. Not to mention the fact that he's still got a ton to give to future wrestlers and martial artists from a coaching perspective. 35 years old, bright future. You know, really is a fight career to be proud of. But let's get to this interview. As you guys know, I've been doing the show for a long time, and sometimes, you know, just for my own sanity, I have to break things up with an interview that doesn't strictly fit the mold of an MMA podcast. And usually I can kind of explain it away by calling it a podcast about podcasting, because that always plays, you know, not that I have to explain it to anybody, I guess, but, you know, that's what this is. Francis Ellis is a stand-up comic, a brilliant blogger, and now a podcast host for a show called Oops, along with his friend Giulio Gallerati. And he's probably best known for his time at Barstool Sports. Now, I'm a huge Barstool fan. That's where I got to know his work, got familiar with him. He was later fired from Barstool Sports, somewhat of a rarity in itself, to be honest. And it all basically came down to bad timing and one mistake, which sparked this idea for the podcast Oops, about those kind of moments in people's lives and how they move past them. But anyway, it was an awesome interview. So without further ado, here he is, Francis Ellis. It was a good one. Enjoy. All right, well, what's up, man? Thanks for the time.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I first became familiar with you through Barstool, specifically that first season of Barstool Idol. I figured that's as good a place as any to start things. So how did you sort of, I guess, find out about that competition? When did you first start reading Barstool, all that stuff? How did that sort of go down? What's the background there?
I had been reading Barstool for a couple years. I went to college in Boston, and it was the thing that people talked about in Boston, but I didn't really know what it was. And then I think after college was when I started really kind of enjoying the writing of KFC and Big Cat and Dave and whatnot. And I remember as I moved to New York to become a comedian, try to do stand-up, and I was tutoring, and I would kind of check in with the site here and there. And I had this thought that I could write for the site.
Sure.
Because I thought, I feel like I could write there, but I felt like everyone thinks that.
Right.
And then one day I saw this call for auditions for this Barstool Idol thing. And I was doing a lot of stand-up at the time, and I just figured I would audition with stand-up and see if I could get my foot in the door. And I kind of just applied and sent a tape in on a whim. And office manager Brett later told me, years later, once I was working there, that I was, that they received thousands of applications, but only about 40 of them actually had a tape or something to show. The vast majority were just people emailing and saying, I'm a huge fan. I don't do any comedy right now or writing, but I'm a quick learner and you guys will be lucky to have me. I'm a go Prez go kind of guy.
Right. I think a lot of it was people basically identifying as a Barstool fan and being like, oh, I get the joke, guys. Like, I can do this too. And I think rather than actually bringing a tangible skill to the table, I feel like a lot of people were just like, no, trust me. Like, me and my friends, we talk just like the Barstool guys. We can hang, and I feel like that's almost what a lot of people think qualifies as getting them in the door.
That's exactly right. But, by the time that I was applying, it had become this full-fledged, very successful multimedia company,
right,
built on originality and true creativity.
So did you predate Bart? So when you said you've been in New York for like 2 years or whatever when the Barstool Idol thing came around, did you?
No, I'd been in New York for about probably 6 years. I started at Barstool in 2016. So I had moved to New York when I was in 2011. So I'd been doing stand-up in New York for 5 years.
Okay, so that's interesting in itself. That obviously I'm from Connecticut, similar thing where New England is basically the little pocket where Barstool was popular at first, like 10, 15 years ago, and you found out about it there. So then to be in New York and then have this company that you knew about in Boston come to New York and kind of make that step to become the big major national outlet they are now is kind of interesting that you were already there, sort of not waiting for that opportunity, but it kind of came to you in a way.
Dude, that's a really good point. It was this satellite organization where everybody was blogging from their own apartments in Chicago, Philly, Boston, New York. And when it was all consolidated under this one roof with the Chernin buyout in New York, that's when it kind of felt closer to home. It felt more like a reality to me. And I thought, okay, yeah, now that they're here, might as well apply. But I still didn't, dude, even when I applied, even when I sent my tape in, there was no clarity as to what it could lead to. It was not clear that even if you were to win whatever it was they were setting up, that you would necessarily get a job there.
Right.
Later on I would find out that, every day that Barstool Idol happened, they were just kind of like cooking up the plans for it the morning of. Nobody knew what it was going to be. Everyone who worked there kind of thought it was like an annoying nuisance project that they'd put together.
That is sort of the Barstool way, though. I feel like to that morning be like, all right, what's the competitions for today? Like, and that is the charm of Barstool too, is like the lack of preparation, because people are talented enough to kind of go off the cuff. It would make sense that's the behind the scenes on Barstool Idol.
Totally. Yeah. So months went by where I didn't hear anything, and then I got an email saying I'd been selected to come in and audition, and there was no clear. I didn't know what that was going to be about. And then I went in one day and I was scared out of my mind, because here was this office that you'd seen so many times on rundowns and all the stuff that you follow. And all of a sudden you're face to face with Dave and Big Cat and these people that, you kind of think are celebrities and are very familiar to you. And they sort of locked us in this room and had us wait as they figured out an order for us. And the first guy, I was chosen to go second, and the first guy went up and did stand up and they didn't like him. And then I went up and did okay. And I think by comparison, they just said that I was much better than the first guy. And that helped me out a lot. So I got passed through to the next phase. And I had no idea what that was.
Well, the first sort of bit that I remember that stood out to me was when you did the Riptide parody down in the subway station. Because for those who don't know, you had just got diagnosed with cancer. It turns out it was a mix-up. You didn't have cancer, but at the moment you thought you did, and you kind of took that tragic news and turned it into, you know, something funny and entertaining, which is kind of a theme throughout your career, especially now. It ties in with the podcast you're doing now and everything. But that was the moment where I was like, oh, like this guy is standing out from the pack of these other Barstool Idol contestants. And then obviously you did what you did once you were hired full time. But you know, I feel like that was the first moment where I was like, this guy is like a unique personality. He is a standout, and you know, could be a star at this company.
Oh, I appreciate that, man. Yeah, you know, that week was by far the most insane week of my entire life. We went in, we didn't know what was going on. There were 10 of us. Every day someone got voted off on Facebook Live in front of tens of thousands of hardcore stoolies who were just ripping us apart. It was very hard to distinguish yourself. But as the week wore on, I started, you know, the first day it was like, who could get the most cheesecake? And that was impossible. Like there was no way for me to, you know, and I almost got voted off on that first day. And then Wednesday, I got the call from my doctor. I went up to my doctor's office. I'd had surgery in December to have polyps removed from my throat. And he told me that they were tumors. And I remember I drove back to the office in a cab and I was crying on the phone with my family. And I walked back into the office and I had to go right on KFC radio for a test segment. And Kevin could tell that I was pretty shaken up. He said, "Is everything all right?" And I said, "Dude, I don't think so." He goes, "You're not about to tell me you have cancer, are you?" He said that.
Yeah, I remember that actually.
And I was like, holy shit. Like, well, kind of. Yeah, that's what I was just told. And then, you know, I ended up winning the thing and got the job. And 3 weeks later, they found that the tests had been swapped and whatnot. And then Nate blogged that I had faked cancer to get a job at Barstool before I could even explain what had happened. And then Dave started telling that story on radio because it's a funnier story.
Right. Well, I was going to say, with those rumors circulating, you know, because of the timing of it all and whatever, people obviously, especially like commenters and all that, kind of thought, you know, oh, he's doing this sympathy vote, whatever. But what was most interesting for me through all that, because I assumed you weren't fake, you had to be a monster to make that up to try to get a job at Barstool, especially you didn't even know, you know, what the situation was. Like that's some crazy foresight to construct that whole thing as like a false narrative. But what was most interesting to me about all that was how fast you were introduced, you know, to that other side of Barstool, the commenters, the drama, the gossip. You were kind of thrown right into it, not only by being basically judged on Facebook Live, but then to have this you know, false narrative right away. You were the center of like the Barstool headline, you know, in the office kind of story. What was that first stretch of employment like? Because I have to imagine that was, you know, almost as crazy, if not crazier, than that first week.
Dude, I packed up my shit twice. I gathered my belongings with the intention of walking out the door and never coming back. I was so sure I was going to quit.
Wow.
Because I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't handle the fact that my boss was calling me a psychopath on radio, that everyone was just making fun of me. And, you know, everyone, like Big Cat, Kevin, everybody was piling on. It wasn't as if anybody there had my back. I think they all just jumped on this. I remember Rhea and Glennie Balls calling in and saying that I was a psychopath and a liar. And meanwhile, I had just endured the thought that I had throat cancer,
right? Which
was a pretty tough thing for my family. Like, it just was not something that I was prepared for. And I admit that, you know, I was definitely culpable in a way in that I shouldn't have shared with Kevin the news of my diagnosis, I should have probably kept that private, but I was just caught so off guard, and it was like it happened so fast. And, I just remember thinking in that first week, like, I can't do this. This is crazy. Like, this is such a nightmare. And I lost a whole bunch of weight. I was fucking miserable, dude.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense with you. I mean, because you're just looking at it, even just the details of it, of just being in the office and having people pile on and whatever, like that sucks. I almost forgot about the fact that you also just went through the emotional roller coaster of being diagnosed with cancer and then finding out you don't have it. So like that's all going on anyway, and then you get all the craziness of being thrust into like the center. Like a lot of people who are new Barstool employees aren't the center of attention right off the bat.
Yeah. I remember having a thought one day after I walked out of a radio session of like, well, would it have been better for me if I had had cancer?
Okay.
If this were legit.
Yeah.
And that was when I started thinking, wow, the Barstool machine is really corrupting my thinking, because no, obviously that's not better, but you get twisted around in there. It's a fucking blender. So I don't know. I guess things settled down after a month. I started making these This is Barstool sketches, and people seem to like those. And I kind of found my footing, and 6 months in, I got a raise, and that's when I started to actually feel like maybe I could make it work,
Yeah, sure. So that was my next question, actually is, after this initial whirlwind, it did seem like you became, I guess found your footing is the best way to put it, but you went into the fold more. It wasn't, you were somebody, you got the radio show, obviously, in the morning that was, down the road. You did the Barstool Variety Hour. You were doing like original content, and I think really great work, but I'm curious, looking back at the full time on it, what are your thoughts overall? Like, 'cause obviously the beginning was crazy, the end was not ideal. Your thoughts overall on the time at Barstool, are they positive, are they negative? How do you kind of feel about it?
I think everybody knew that I wasn't going to be at Barstool forever. I wasn't a lifer, I wasn't a guy who was tattooing the stool and stripes on my chest. I didn't really go to war and get involved with the feuds that would occur between Deadspin and ESPN, with the one exception being the time that they came after me. And I just wrote a very like tongue-in-cheek response blog about my emails. But I think Dave knew that. I would say I was more of like a gun for hire there, in that I think people appreciated my work, and Dave recognized that I was pretty good at what I was doing, but I was never going to be a guy who got equity. And the flip side was I was not going to be a guy who they would go to bat for if I did something that brought bad publicity to the company.
Right. And I actually think Dave said as much at one point, like when obviously all the buzz was about your firing, I think when they asked him, it was more or less in different words, or maybe not even really in different words, exactly what you just said, where he was like, this is a guy who always sort of had 1 foot in, 1 foot out or something, I think is how he worded it.
Yeah, but, it was one of those things where, like, I remember 3 months into working there, he wrote a blog where he was like, there are certain people at this company that will defend PFT, Big Cat, Kevin, etc. Everyone else is on their own. And that was the moment where I was like, okay, I got to look out for myself and my future and my career here, because they're not going to protect me. Like, this is a job. It's a job that I cannot rely on for anything other than a paycheck, as long as I'm doing well. And I think a lot of people lose sight of that. I think people think Barstool becomes like this community or this weird camp where you go every day. But dude, I learned pretty quick, you're only as good as your last blog, and you're only as bad as your next blog. You know, I don't know if that makes sense, but
No,
like
sure.
at any given, like I was doing pretty well the day that I got fired. You know what I mean? Like, you know, admittedly over the 6 months leading up to it, I'd kind of run out of steam a little bit. And people think that, you know, maybe my stand-up special, not getting enough Barstool Gold subscriptions had something to do with it, or the fact that I didn't dress up for the Dunkin' Donut Awards. Dude, that wasn't really it, you know? It was that I wrote a blog on a week when Barstool was under the heat lamp from the HBO Real Sports piece, and I just, you know, there was nothing. They said that they felt they had no choice, and I didn't even blame them, dude. I don't give a shit, you know. Like they fired me. It was their decision. I get it. I probably would have done the same thing if I'd been in Dave's shoes. It's a publicity move, very much. Let's fire the dude. Let's fire the white dude who wrote the mean things about the girl who passed away. And I don't, you know, you got to know better if you're hoping to keep the job. So part of me thinks I kind of like euthanized myself out of that place.
Yeah, and I would say that was probably a wake-up call for a lot of people who do feel like it's like a job that you can't get fired from. So I think that is the mindset of a lot of people who still work there, and at least it should have been a wake-up call. I don't know if it actually was or not, but and I know you talked about the actual firing part of this at length on a bunch of different podcasts, so we don't need to go too into that. But actually, if anyone's interested in that story, I'd recommend checking out the first episode of the Oops podcast, because I think that was your best telling of, you know, all the details of what happened, and it's funny too. It's not like a super like serious dramatic episode of the podcast, but I'm more curious about the fallout of it all, because you're suddenly thrust into this sort of unexpected position of no longer having a steady job and having to figure out where to go from here and you know, whatever. And I'm sure there was always thought, as you've kind of alluded to, of what the future is long term. Does it involve Barstool? Does it not? But certainly you weren't expecting to make those decisions when you woke up that morning. So tell me what that initial shock was like. Where was your head at in those very first moments?
Yeah, I mean, well, the craziest thing was that, like, the Washington Post wrote about me.
Yeah.
You know, I guess I expected Deadspin and the Daily Beast to do their worst, which they did too, but I didn't think it was going to become national news. I mean, I had misread a Twitter headline and had written a blog, which, I mean, if you go back, it's really not that mean. I think the worst jokes I made were about her. I mentioned she was on sugar daddy dating websites, but I didn't say anything like rude about it. Whatever. The point is, when those big outlets came out and wrote about me, that I thought my career was over. And I thought I was going to be canceled. I thought, you know, what do I do now? Because there's too much of me on the internet talking about my dick to ever go back to like a normal job.
Yeah.
And now I've got this black mark on my resume that will prohibit me from being hired at, you know, a place like Complex or GQ as a writer. So what do I do? Am I finished? And it was pretty bad, dude. I was dazed for like 3 days. I couldn't think. I couldn't really speak to anybody. And I remember we went to visit my girlfriend's parents. I actually got fired on the train down there. She was already down there, and I walked in to the kitchen counter, and they were sitting down to dinner, and I just had to tell everyone I'd just been fired. And it was a pretty tough introduction to my girlfriend's family.
Yeah.
But, you know, over the weeks, you know, a week goes by, pretty sure the Jeffrey Epstein stuff came out, and then everyone shifted their focus to that and was like, oh yeah, that's way fucking worse, you know?
I feel like there are these like truly like deserve to be canceled people, but I think in general, like the cancel culture, that is sort of the yin and yang of it, is that on one hand, it's horrible and you get hit with like everybody all at once, but it does sort of pass fast because people are always looking for the next thing that's like, all right, now who are we going to cancel? And it kind of moves on, unless you're like a real monster like Jeffrey Epstein or something like that. But like otherwise, I feel like it does pass, but I'm sure when you're in it, you're not even thinking about that.
Yeah, you think the world is watching you and that everyone's trying to find where, take your head off. But what I can say is that very quickly you realize, you gain the perspective of knowing that a lot of the people who are mad at you on the internet, on Twitter and whatnot, they're mad at Barstool. They're not mad at you.
Yeah.
It was always Barstool Sports writer writes a blog about a missing girl. It wasn't Francis Ellis does this. So, and I that was one thing I always felt really bad about. I think that's why they had to fire me, was that it was clear this was bad for the company.
Yeah.
But, I remember Ellen DeGeneres' executive producer wrote a long tweet kind of like forgiving me and supporting me. There was a New York Times woman writer who came out in support of me, and everyone was just like, yo, let's hold our horses for a second. This is not equivalent to every horrible story we've read about a man, doing something mean to women in the last 2 years. This is a mistake that didn't hurt anybody. Clearly he's sorry. He lost his job. Like maybe that's enough.
Yeah, I feel like you always hear like Jim Norton. I always comes to mind as somebody who's like, if it's in the vein of comedy, if the goal is to try to make people laugh, then even if it is like edgy or cross the line or whatever, you really can't crucify someone for that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's intention, and you should be able to tell someone's intention, right, based on the tone or the forum, which is why you look at. I think the great example for me is like you look at Kramer and the outbursts that he had at the Laugh Factory 10 years ago, and he was just screaming the N-word at a guy because he was furious.
Yeah, that wasn't a setup and a punchline. That was an angry outburst. Yeah. Right. Also, that has to be inside you if that's how you're reacting. But
yeah, exactly. It's like anybody watching that would have to say, yeah, I don't think Kramer was trying to be funny here. He was trying to be mean.
Right.
And with me, it was a Friday morning blog. Like, would anyone say that I was actually slut shaming this girl as if I'm some character from the Scarlet Letter? Like, what is this, Puritan England? It's fucking crazy. No, nobody would have said that. So when that writer from the Daily Beast wrote that was when I was like, man, the internet is just, fuck this guy, because he's the one who nobody had thought that.
Right.
And he was just trying to put that in people's brains to throw gasoline on the fire.
Yeah, and it works too, which is why people do that. Like those are the articles. I'm sure he got a ton of hits on that article. Exactly.
But, what was crazy too was that the comedy world, my world of stand-up, everyone who heard this story was just like, are you kidding me? You got fired for writing a lighthearted blog at a company that, really considers itself an edgy free speech outlet.
Right.
Why? Nobody could understand it. And I still don't really have an answer for that. I guess the bottom line is certain people can get away with certain things and other people don't have as much leeway. But, in the ensuing months, I started to get a lot of job offers because of my writing. I think a lot of companies wanted me to come work with them, but I kind of held off and just wanted to see what my options were. A lot of the jobs I was getting offered were not steps up from Barstool. So I held off and really focused on my stand-up, and now I've got this podcast and things are going pretty well. I'm I'm honestly surprised, but life goes on, you know?
Yeah, sure. And I want to get into the stand-up in the podcast, but just to put a pin on the Barstool thing, I guess. What is your relationship with them now? You know, just even as a website, do you keep in touch with any of those guys? Do you follow what they're doing now, or have you had to sort of take a step away and kind of have a clean break from it?
Yeah, I keep in touch a little bit. I don't like to really reach out to them because I don't want to be like the annoying kid who got cut from the soccer team, you know, or, you know, it's like a little bit like reaching out to your ex-girlfriend to try to prove that you're doing fine now, you know, like, well, if you really were, you wouldn't feel the need to do that. Right. So occasionally, yeah, I'll text with Kevin or some other people and run into some people. Large has been really supportive. He actually is, you know, a truly wonderful friend and
nice.
Somebody that I care about a lot. I saw Dave on the street the other day. We walked together for a bit. I don't think anyone there really harbors much ill will towards me. And I think one of the big reasons is that company just moves so fast. It's just, you know, the whole, what was it? The union thing happened, and that story consumes the company for a week, and then they move on to the next thing. So it's like, there's no time for them to sing me a swan song or to care about how I'm doing, and I don't blame them for that.
Sure. And then obviously the next step was to start this podcast. Oops. What's your co-host's name? Giulio Gallerati? Did I say that right?
Giulio Gallerati. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously doing a podcast makes sense as a logical sort of next step for you. It's something you can set up, do on your own. It's independent, all this stuff where it is kind of the perfect, you know, next step as far as, you know, what you do post Barstool. But to make the theme of that podcast basically, you know, the fucking up and how to survive it is such a cool sort of meta perspective that you're obviously uniquely qualified to give. And it's almost like you turn that bad thing into the next project. So there was some thought that went into that, but I don't know. When did you basically come up with the idea of like, all right, this is what I'm going to do next?
So I had the idea pretty quickly that I should do a podcast. And I think the big reason was I had a radio show at Barstool that was pretty popular. Right. And I saw that once I left there, a lot of people kind of mentioned that they missed hearing me talk and my thoughts and everything. So I wanted to give the fans that I had a place to find me. And so a podcast seemed like a natural place to do that. I like talking about stuff into a microphone, which is very narcissistic, but I do. And
you're talking to a podcast host, so I can't
yeah, there you go. There, yeah. So I just came up with the concept. It seemed like a good idea. I ran it by, you know, my manager, and he thought it was a sound idea. So we got it up and running as quickly as possible. And then we booked a bunch of cool guests, and we actually sold a bunch of ads pretty early on. So I had spent a ton of money on camera equipment and sound gear to make sure we could have a video component for social media clips. And that was what I think fed a lot of people into the podcast. And so we've now paid back all of that, and now we're making money on it, which is pretty nice.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, right away, clearly, with episode 1, like you had the YouTube element, everything looked, you know, high definition, the sound quality is great. Most podcasts, this one included, and pretty much everybody's, when you first start off, it you know, it sounds like you're just recording on speakerphone on your iPhone or whatever. And now I feel like in order to sort of break into that world, even with you having the name you have from Barstool and all this, you do need to sort of dive right in with you know, a professional level product.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think I'm friends with Theo Vaughn, and, you know, I've always thought that his podcast looks so good in the clips that he does. So I talk to him a lot, and, you know, I know it took them years to kind of figure out how to do it the way they want it. They're always improving. So I figured if I started with a baseline that was close to what they've got, you know, that might as well jump out in front if I can.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. So you mentioned Theo Von's podcast, but what other podcasts are you a fan of? Because the podcast explosion really began with the comedy scene, which is where you're from. Those are still, more often than not the biggest shows. You have Serial and whatever, but I feel like the big shows are still in that comedy world, and obviously you're booking guests from that comedy world, everything. So what shows are in your rotation right now? What are you listening to?
To be honest, I don't really listen to a ton of podcasts. But I do check in on them and I watch clips and stuff. Obviously, Rogan is kind of like the Bible for me.
Sure.
But I love Tim Dillon's podcast. I've done that one. He's a great dude. I think he's one of the funniest people alive right now. Andrew Schultz, Flagrant 2 is great. I love those guys. I've done that a few times. And Theo, I think the whole like LA kind of mafia of podcasts between Bert and Bill Burr and D'Elia and Schaub and all those guys is pretty cool. But then I've also been opened up to this world of incredible women's podcasts here in New York City, and have become very good friends with Ashley Hesseltine and Raina Greenberg from Girls Gotta Eat, and their podcast is incredible. I've never seen a more engaged fan base. They'll put up an Instagram story and sell out a theater. That's great. I like Hannah Berner's podcast is great. There's a new one out now. Andrew Collins, his is called Puddles. He's a really funny guy. So those are the ones I tend to bump around to here in New York.
Well, I was going to say, it feels like what's really always been appealing about podcasts versus, traditional radio or TV shows or any other form of media really is that you have like this community feel where different people are going on different people's podcasts and almost like you take a Bert Kreischer and a Joe Rogan, Ari Shaffir, these guys, and you feel like, oh, I know that group of friends. Like you become like intimately familiar with them just because there is this community where everyone's kind of sharing content and collaborating and all this stuff. And I feel like that's always kind of been, I don't know, I guess the underlying appeal of it all, the thing that separates it from, like I said, traditional radio or anything else. Yeah,
I totally agree. There's definitely a camaraderie and let's help the next guy up. I especially with Rogan, he's pulled up, so he's elevated so many people around him. And it's known in comedy that to become one of Rogan's guys or to get the nod from Rogan now is the equivalent to getting invited over to the couch by Johnny Carson back in the 1980s. So if you're tapped by him, you become a made man, so to speak.
Sure. And I really am enjoying your show. You had, was like Karen Feehan on last week. She's great. I know her from the Chip Chipperson podcast, so that's how, or she comes on Jim and Sam too, but that's how I know her. But she was great. I haven't had the chance to listen to Mike Feeney. I think that came out yesterday. But talk to me about the vision for this thing. Is it about building the audience right now, chasing great guests? Do you want to kind of turn it into doing a live show kind of version of it? What's the trajectory of this podcast for you?
Well, I think, we're still definitely tweaking with it a little bit, but for me, my thought was, having come off of this crazy ordeal of being fired so publicly and the roller coaster of emotions and the fear and the anxiety that I just explained, that's an interesting story that people can relate to. Being fired is a very traumatic, scary thing. And to hear stories from people who have gone through their own firings, like a guy like Shane Gillis from SNL. Like he was somebody that I was that's exactly the type of guest that I would want to have on this podcast.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And it's not exactly to say, that we're going to just blindly defend and try to vindicate our guest, but it's just to give them a place where they can give their side of the story and then let people figure out for themselves, where they think, who they think is really at wrong. And it's usually going to be that guy, but I'd love to have a Louis C.K. on, obviously. I mean, go figure. But just to hear him talk and reflect on his whole thing. And I personally believe that even, the most vile, vilified people deserve a chance to speak on their own behalf. That used to be the way things were. And now it's this idea of let's silence and condemn. And I think it's pretty fucked up.
There is something inherently funny too about like somebody like going through it, like Shane Gillis, for example, and then going on a podcast called Oops to explain it. Like I feel like that already is like a baseline funny. And then, it is a platform where you guys do give people a chance to sort of explain their side of things. And granted, I think at least the episodes I've heard, no one's had like a real bad, like, national story fuck up, none of the guests so far. But like, if it is something like that, it'd be interesting to, I don't know. Yeah, I guess you're right. In this culture to have a platform to give your side of the story when there really aren't any. I mean, I feel like Rogan did it for Roseanne and stuff like that and whatever, but to have that be sort of the theme of the show, I think is interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. Roseanne's another great example. I mean, people are just getting fired and canceled, losing their jobs left and right. Billy Bush, that would be the perfect guest.
Yeah.
Here's a guy who was just on a bus with a billionaire celebrity, Donald Trump, who is, spewing off about grabbing women by the pussy. And he kind of laughed, which is exactly the response that I would have. I know that for a fact. And if anyone says that they would in that moment say, hey, Mr. Trump, you shouldn't speak that way. How dare you? They're fucking lying.
Right.
I mean, maybe, a woman would, but any man would just be like, nice or something. And so he got fired. Billy Bush did. And it's like, well, to me, he's a guy who doesn't really deserve to lose his job. I don't know. And I would love to hear his thoughts on all of that.
Right. I feel like your sweet spot is the people who almost got hit by, stray bullets of this cancel culture. Like the people who as this machine of just like ruining people's lives and careers chugs on, there are people who just kind of were in the wrong place at the wrong time and aren't these monsters. It's not like what the machine was intended for, like a Billy Bush. And I feel like those are the people who have the interesting sort of angle where if you hear their side of the story, you're like, oh wow, yeah, that guy got screwed.
Exactly. Yeah. That is a very interesting place to sort of to mine for content.
Sure. And then I wanted to get into the stand-up. I was actually at the recording for your special in Boston. I went with a few friends, had a great time. Was that surreal? I mean, a packed house in one of the best theaters in the country. I feel like, especially for comedy, I feel like the Wilbur is revered. You hear the top comics in the world talk about how this is one of their favorite venues. Recording your first special, what were the emotions like that weekend?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming.
Sure.
It was, probably the best night of my career. It was incredible. And it's something that I will always be able to point to. Let's say that, God forbid, I never get anywhere else in this career and, I have to go do something else. I can say beyond a shadow of a doubt that I made it. I shot a special at the Wilbur Theater. There really, when I set out with this idea of becoming a comedian and I was starting from scratch as an open micer, if you had told me that within 7 years I would be shooting two shows of a special at the Wilbur in Boston for 1,800 people, I would have been like, well, fuck yeah, that's the goal.
Right.
So it was unbelievable. I mean, that's another reason why I have really no ill will towards Barstool. They did so much for me, and what a night. It was just so fun. It was awesome. Especially did you come to the late show or the early show?
The late show.
Yeah, the late show was way better.
Good.
I mean, that was we had I got a standing ovation, and then I came out and did an encore. And
yeah, the Game of Thrones song, right?
Yeah.
So I'll say this, not that my opinion means anything, but going into it, so I knew you through Barstool, and I knew you did stand up because that was kind of part of it, and obviously there's other people that do, like, I feel like a lot of people just do stand up, and I didn't know what to expect. I've never seen stand up before, or your stand up before, I mean, but I feel like I watch a lot of stand up, so I almost went into it being like, all right, I'll go because I like him at Barstool, but like, I don't know if a stand up is going to be any good. And it, like, I'm not just saying this because you're on the phone, it really was incredible. I was like, oh man, this is like worthy of an hour. This isn't something Barstool just rushed out because they needed content for Gold or whatever. I almost didn't know what to expect going in, and I was like very pleasantly surprised. I was like, man, this is a very funny, clean, well set up hour.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's crazy because I actually was very proud of it and very happy with it. And, we put it out on Barstool Gold, and the problem was by the time we put it on Gold, everybody who was going to sign up for Gold already had. So we only got 70 specific signups for Gold or something like that.
Yeah.
But Gold was a joke. I mean, Dave hated it.
I was gonna say, I think he made it clear that it's something he kind of had to do because of Journey, but like he didn't want to do it in the first place. Obviously, if the heart's not in it, it's not going to turn into a big thing. He always wanted to have that free sort of platform.
Right. So he didn't even want it to be a part of Barstool, and then to put a stand-up special behind a thing that the most public, most popular person at the company is outright being like, yeah, I'm not into this. It's not easy to get people to sign up regardless of what you've got as content. And then at that Duncan Awards, he made some joke about how, maybe I should have spent some of the money we'd used on renting my piano on a better outfit. And then the next day I wrote this like apology blog, which was just gamesmanship. I was trying to get the stupid fucking angry audience back in my favor by pretending to be humble. We used to do that all the time. We used to just like manipulate the readership.
I'm sure.
And
I think
everyone was
not
like,
that hard to see through, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I was like, pretending as if I was sorry for putting out a disappointing special. But the reality was, it was a good special, and there were interested buyers. And unfortunately, we weren't. Erica, I think, had said we couldn't consider selling it to these places because she didn't want to do that to our Gold subscribers after what had happened with the documentary, where Dave cut out one of the documentary pieces and made it public for everyone because it was a week where Barstool was in big trouble for something. And then the Gold subscribers, a bunch of them canceled their subscriptions because all of a sudden a piece of content that was meant to be behind the paywall, which they had paid for, was being given to people for free. And that made them very, very angry. So Erica had told me we can't do this now, but I mean, that was all just like the beginning of the end,
So how does it work as far as, is there like a certain period of time and then the rights are freed up, or do they just indefinitely own that special?
Yeah, it's theirs. They paid for the whole production of it. I mean, I think they spent $70,000 or something. So, I don't really know. I don't even know if it's still up on Barstool Gold, if I'm being honest, but it might be. If it is, it, speaks to this idea that they clearly didn't think it was that bad.
Yeah, I don't know. They haven't like gone back and taken down, I think I know. Today I just quick on YouTube, looked for the variety show that's all there. It's not like they just destroyed your content, so it's still there. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I don't know about the special specifically. That's the other thing too. Like, clearly I'm a big Barstool fan, but I don't have Gold. Like, I wasn't there's just too much stuff to pay for. I didn't want to pay for the subscription service when 99% of the content at Barstool is free anyway. The only thing I was even interested in, because the special I saw live, the only thing I was really interested in was that documentary, but I was like, I don't know, maybe I'll try to find it somewhere else. Like, it was never worth it, I don't think, to get Gold, and this is coming from somebody myself who is a big Barstool fan. So I don't really know what the numbers are on Gold, but it just seems like not I don't know, not the best idea they've had.
Yeah, he built this company on the idea of everything's free. We're going to be free. We're not going to be bogged down by ads and paywalls. And then for the corporate bigwigs to foist that paywall upon him, that was never going to go well. So I don't know. I hear they're selling themselves or they're being sold to a gambling website now. I don't know if that's true. Have you heard anything about that?
No, I haven't. But I mean, I feel like 75% of their content now is gambling, so that would make sense. I know they're always looking for that second big sale, so
right.
I don't know.
Right.
But
yeah, well, fair enough.
Yeah. Do you miss the pure writing aspect to it too? Because I feel like that was, not to qualify, but I feel like that was at least one of your strongest weapons was the pure blogging, which I almost think Barstool moved away from. Everything's kind of geared towards podcast and video content and whatever, but you were one of the better writers at the site. I would say there's only a handful of guys now. Like, for example, KFC and Big Cat, great writers, they don't do it anymore. They've, it's just not their current role at the company. So I feel like, that was one of your strong weapons. Do you feel like you missed the blogging aspect? Do you think that muscle is almost getting flexed now in, whatever it is, preparing for a podcast, an interview, however you're expressing yourself?
So I'm not trying to be coy here, but I'm about to start writing at a new company.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I don't need, this isn't like an investigative podcast. I don't need to dig deeper. I'll wait for the announcement, but that's good news.
I'm getting back. I'm very excited because I do miss that. And that's one thing where I don't think anyone really cares where you write. Your writing is just going to be up on the internet. People will read it if it's good. So
yeah, they'll see you tweet about it and click on the link. I don't think anyone cares about the website that it's on,
Exactly. But it's a great place, and I'm really pumped, and I'm going to, get back into that. And I do really believe that I was one of the stronger writers that ever worked at Barstool. And I don't think that that's a crazy thing to say. So I'm looking forward to getting back and stretching those muscles.
Sure. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it, obviously. And then I've got to ask about the acting, the sort of third wing of your bio, I guess, if you want to call it that. But what's the latest on that front? I know the departure, you talked about this a little bit on your podcast, but the departure from Barstool opened up opportunities to at least pursue different things as far as acting and trying to get auditions and things in other places. Or is there anything going on that front, or is that sort of on the back burner for now?
Yeah, I'm not really going out. It's not something I'm really pursuing that actively. That's something I've always done throughout my career. I did a bunch of commercials early on, and I've done little things here and there. But it's honestly, I think for me, the big focus is really on improving my stand-up and building my new hour so that I can have work to showcase to festivals, to casting directors, and, find my way into my next big project that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have a timetable on the new hour? Do you know, generally when you're hoping to put that out?
It's a good question. I would say that, what I've got right now is, I shot my special at the end of May, and then I dumped all that material.
Sure.
Since then, June, July, August, September, October, in 6 months, I've probably got 40 new minutes of material. So by the end of this year, I hope to have a full new hour. But then it'll be, another 6 months, I would think, of touring it to really make sure it's super solid. And then, try to find somebody who would be willing to produce or buy a special or potentially do an album. I'm not sure how I want to do it. There's all kinds. The Andrew Schultz model. I mean, he's kind of become a mentor to me of just putting everything out for free. And if people like it, they like it, and it'll help your career. A lot of comedians are following that, and it seems to be working because it's just really hard to sell a special to Netflix, And
even if you do, I feel like these days it just gets lost in the show. Don't they come out with a new one every Tuesday now? I'm not sure if is it that often? I think it is that. I'm pretty sure like Tuesdays, it's some sort of, if it's not a direct comedy special, it's like something in that vein because they release new shows and movies and whatever on Fridays. I think Tuesdays it's mostly stand up, but it's definitely more flooded than it ever has been. Let's put it that way. Yeah, it's very saturated, but I still think a great
special on Netflix does get seen and talked about, you know?
Sure, yeah.
But what happened was, once Netflix really started pumping out these specials, HBO and Amazon and Hulu are now getting in the game too. And HBO is, they kind of let their comedy special department sit and languish for a few years, but now they're putting a lot more money into it, and they've got some Gary Gulman's special was incredible. Dan Soder has one coming out in December. They're commissioning some really big acts to put specials together, and you know, that would be, if you could get a special there or Netflix or any one of those places, I think it's a huge achievement.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you're getting published in people's like living rooms, basically. Like everyone has, if not every single streaming platform, at least Netflix, at least HBO, at least these massive ones, some version of that, and then, you know, they're literally dropping your special in front of their face. And then the way it works with algorithms too, if you're on the top of the freaking queue or whatever, then all of a sudden, like you are going to be exposed to more people that way than you would be if you were just sharing it on social media or something.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Plus, they'll pay for it, which is nice.
That is an important factor.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, that's actually all I have for you. I appreciate all the time. I appreciate the honesty. Looking forward to the announcement. I assume there's going to be some sort of announcement coming up of where this outlet is that you're going to be writing for. Everything, man. The podcast. I'm a fan, so I appreciate the time. Dude,
I appreciate it. This is a great interview. Very structured podcast. You know what you're doing. It's nice. It's a luxury. Trust me.
Well, I appreciate it. Also, this is an MMA show, so also I'm short of like 200 episodes, and eventually, just to not go crazy, occasionally I have to break out and do something outside of it just to have these kind of throwaway episodes. Otherwise, I don't know. If I talked about MMA every single day or every week for 5 years, I feel like I'd lose my mind. So you can always get away with podcasting about podcast. That always plays. So that's the goal here.
I love it. Awesome. Thanks again, bud. Best of luck, and thanks for having me.
Sure. Thanks, man. Take it easy.
Bum, 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 bum.
All right, and a big thank you to Francis. No UFC this weekend, but there is Bellator on Saturday. Michael Venom Page is fighting in the main event. Fabian Edwards is on the card. It's not a bad little card for a UFC off week. I believe it's in the UK. It's featuring a lot of UK fighters. But yeah, it's something to do. Something to do while the UFC is not on. Check me out on the Watchmen Companion podcast for The Disorderly. And if you're not already watching The Watchmen, get on it. It's amazing. But you can find all that over at thedisorderly.com. I also joined the Ratings Pending podcast to review Dr. Sleep last week, or 2 weeks ago. I feel like all my days are running together. I don't know. But go ahead, check that out as well if you're interested. And that's it for me. So thank you so much for listening, guys. Please rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. Tell a friend about the show if you like it. And that's it. I'm out. Peace. See you next week. Have a good one.
MMA bad.